In the last few videos, we imported and set up our PlayFab SDK in our Unity game and created a user authentication system where users could register, log in, and reset their passwords. So in this video, we're going to be creating a system that allows our Unity game to interact with our PlayFab database in order to send, receive, and update data as needed. Before we jump into the programming, I've set up a few whiteboard slides to explain to you sort of the architecture of how we're going to create the system. So here we've got our Unity game, and our Unity game is going to somehow have to communicate with the PlayFab database. So to do this, we're going to create a static class called PlayFab Data, which will manage sending, receiving, and updating data inside of our PlayFab database. The way that the PlayFab client API works causes there to be a lot of get and send requests happening at the same time, and this can cause congestion. So what we'll do is we're going to bring in a local copy of all the data that's stored on the PlayFab database. Then what we'll do is only the first time that the game actually requests data from the PlayFab database, this local copy will be filled with all the information that is stored on the PlayFab database, so that now the local copy is simply a reflection of what's on the PlayFab database. Then what this allows us to do is we allow our Unity game to simply interact and update the variables in the local copy. All we need to do is look for any changes in the local copy and simply update the PlayFab database. So now instead of always having to send and receive data, we only have to receive data once. And only every time that there's a change, that's when we start updating the data. Okay, I hope that little whiteboard session made a bit of sense. But before we jump into the programming, make sure you have set up a PlayFab user authentication system, because the PlayFab client API doesn't allow us to interact with it unless the user has logged in through PlayFab. So if you haven't done that, make sure you go and watch my previous videos, and then we can get started. Okay, so in order to test our database interactions, I've gone and created this little UI here with a Unity scroll view, an input field to enter a value name, for example, coins, and the value would be 999 or something like that. And then I've gone and created this prefab over here that's simply some UI with references to the item name and item value text, which we're simply going to use to instantiate inside of our scroll view to display each of the items that are stored in our database. Okay, so the first thing you're going to want to do is we'll create a script and we'll call this PlayFab Data. Then once this is open, you can remove all the mono behavior code, and I'll just make sure that this is a static class. So if we go back to the whiteboard quickly, we can see that we're going to be storing a local copy of all the data. So to do this, we'll create a static dictionary of type string and user data record. And to do this, we'll have to import playfab.client models, and we'll just name this user data. So this dictionary is going to be storing the local copy of all the data that's in the PlayFab database. And you'll also have to be using PlayFab. First method we're going to create is going to be called save data. So we'll make a public static void called save data. This will take some parameters, but we'll only add them in later on. So in order to tell PlayFab to save data, we need to say PlayFab client API .update user data, and the first parameter will be a new update user data request. And over here we're going to have to give it some data to pass or to update the database with. So to do that, we'll add as a parameter a dictionary called data, and then we'll just assign this over here. Then you'll see there's an error happening over here, and that's because we need a callback for if this happened successfully or if it encountered an error. So in order to do that, we'll create another two parameters, and these will be of type action, and it'll take a update user data result as a parameter, and we'll call this on success. And the second one will be an action which has a parameter of PlayFab error, and we'll call this on fail. And then over here as the second parameter, we'll just pass in on success, and the third parameter will be on fail. So now basically what this is going to do is it's going to tell the PlayFab database to save the data we have stored inside the dictionary, and if that function is successful, it's going to call this onSuccess callback, and if it fails, it's going to call this onFail callback. But if you noticed, we haven't used user data anyway. So instead of just directly calling the onSuccess callback, we will have to create a lambda function, and we'll do that by saying success result, and inside this lambda function, this is where we're going to update the local copy of our data. So we'll check if the user data is not equal to null. So in other words, if we have fetched some user data before, we're going to loop through the data that's been given to us, which is going to make changes on the PlayFab database, and we're going to update our local copy of the database according to the data that's supplied to us. So to do that, we'll have to create a new user data record. That's simply because the dictionary is of type user data record. So we'll loop through it by doing a for each loop using the keys in data.keys, and we'll set that equal to a new user data record with the value equal to data at key. Then over here we'll want to check if our local copy of the database, in other words user data, contains this key. Then we're just going to update the value in our local database, and if it doesn't contain it, we are just going to add it to our local database. And then once that's done, we can then call the onSuccess, and as a parameter we pass in the success result. So this is going to essentially do the same thing as the function we had before, the only difference being this is updating the local copy of our database if it successfully updated PlayFab's database. Okay, so the next function we're going to implement is going to be getUserData. So I'm going to make a public static void called getUserData. So this function will be used when our game needs to know, for example, how many coins does a player have. It'll do that by calling this function. And in order to get our data from PlayFab, we just call PlayFab client API.getUserData, and this is going to be a new getUserData request, which we can leave empty. And over here we're going to have to specify a success callback and a fail callback again. So inside these parameters, I'm just going to create an action of type getUserDataResult and an action of type PlayFab error, which will be the two different callbacks. Then over here for the first one we'll call onSuccess and then onFail. But then again, we are forgetting about the local copy of the database. So if we look back at our whiteboard again, the only time we actually want to make a GET request to the PlayFab database is the first time that we're getting the data, because after the first time, we're going to have all the data stored locally on a machine already inside of our local copy. So all we need to do now is check if our local copy is not null. And if it isn't null, then we will just directly call the onSuccess callback. And as the parameter, we'll have to type a new getUserDataResult, and we'll just set data equal to userData. So this is simply going to return our local copy of the database to whichever part of our game is requesting the data. But now you might look at this and think there is a little bit of a problem, because say for example it takes this request 500 milliseconds to get to the server and return back to us. What happens now if the initial request happens and while it's still fetching the data from the database, another request happens? So in that case, we don't want to send two GET requests to the server. So to do this, we're going to bring in another variable. And this is going to be a boolean called isGettingUserData, which will just default it to false. So we'll default it to false. And over here, we're just going to do a while loop to check while we are busy getting the user data from the database. We're simply going to say task.delay 100 milliseconds. So if by any chance the game requests to get the user data while the game is already fetching the data from the database, it's simply going to run this while loop and wait until that request is done and use the result from that same request to be returned. And you will have to import system.threading.tasks to be able to use this. Okay, so if the code reaches this point, that means that we're still on our first ever time of getting the information from the server. I hope this is all making sense. And if it is, then we're going to set isGettingUserData to true. And now over here, we have to complete our onSuccess and onFail functions, because nowhere are we actually storing the local copy of our database. So we're going to change this to onSuccessResult, and we'll turn this into a Lambda function. We can start off just by calling the onSuccess callback by saying onSuccess with the onSuccessResult as a parameter. Then what we'll do here is we'll say userData is equal to onSuccessResult.data. And then we can type here isGettingUserData is equal to false. Then for onFail, we'll want to change this to onFailResult. And here we're going to type isGettingUserData is equal to false. And we'll just call the onFail callback. Okay, so hopefully you've been able to follow along. If not, it does get fairly confusing because of all the callbacks and all that kind of thing. If you just kind of get all this program code down, this PlayFab data class is going to be insanely easy to use once you actually start to interact with the PlayFab database. So now just to recap, we've created a save data function which saves new data to the PlayFab database, and if that happens successfully, it then runs through it and checks where were changes made, and if there were any changes, then it simply updates the local copy of our PlayFab database. Instead of making another request to the database to get the new information, we simply do all of that locally. Then in the getUserData function, this is where firstly we check, is this the first time that this function is called? And if it is, then we actually make the get request to the PlayFab database, and we actually get all the data from the database, and that's where we store it in a local copy of the database called UserData. Then if this function is called again, we're going to see that UserData isn't null, so we simply return UserData as the result. So basically it means that there's no need to actually go and create a whole nother get request to fetch all this data from a remote server, because it's all stored locally in our local copy. So we just return the local copy. Now that all of that is done, we can go and create a script that displays all this information and allows us to interact with our PlayFab database. So now if you go into your PlayFab developer dashboard, then you'll want to click on players and you'll want to click on search, so you can see all the players that have registered with your app. I'm just going to click on this one, for example. And if we go here to player data title, this is where all the data is going to be stored when we are interacting with our PlayFab database. So you'll see here, it's got a key and a value. So basically your data is going to look like this. There we go. And if we save player data, this is how our data is going to be stored in the database. So I'm just going to delete this so we can do this all from scratch through our script. So I'm going to go and create a script called PlayFab Interaction Manager Demo, and I'll open this up. And firstly, we're going to need some references to our UI. So I'll create two input fields, one for the value name and one for value. And I'll just drag the script onto the canvas and create the references to these input fields. Then I'm going to create a reference to our prefab that we created. So I'm going to use this prefab because this is what's going to be instantiated to actually display everything that's in the database. So I'll just drag and drop this in here. Then in our void start, the first thing we're going to want to do is check, is there anything in the database yet? So to do that, in void start, we'll type playfab data.getUserData. And if you remember, the parameters is an onSuccess callback and an onFail callback. So to do that, we will go and create, you can either do them as lambda expressions like this, or we can create actual methods that will handle each thing. So I think we'll do that for simplicity's sake. So our success callback will create a void called onGotDataSuccess. And if you look over here, its parameter needs to be of type getUserDataResult. So we'll type that over here and we'll call this result. Then we'll want to do a for each loop that loops through all the data that we've fetched from the database. So we'll do a for each var info in result.data. And for each bit of information, we're going to instantiate an item. We're going to have to give it a position to instantiate at. So in order to do that, I'm going to create a transform called scrollView. And as the parent, I'm just going to type in scrollView over here. And I'm going to store the instantiated item inside of a variable called iteminfo. Then over here, I'm just going to set iteminfo.nameText.text is equal to info.key, and iteminfo.valueText.text is equal to info.value. So if you look here, result.data is a dictionary of type string and user data record. So we need to say value.value to actually get the string value that's stored inside of the user data record. And then as the first parameter over here, we can say onGotDataSuccess. And then as the last parameter, we're going to create an onPlayFabFailure. If you watched the last videos, you'll see that we already created this method. So I'm just going to copy it from here and paste it over here. So we can just type in PlayFabFailure. And you'll also have to make sure that you are using PlayFab in order to use PlayFab error. And inside our PlayFab login manager, if we successfully logged in, all I'm going to do is say scene manager.load scene and the scene that we want to load. And then we just need to drag in our scene into the build settings, and then we can test this from the beginning. So if we go to our login scene and I go to login, and when I press login, you'll see logged in successfully, and we load our PlayFab interaction manager scene. So as you can see, there's nothing displaying here because if we go into our player data title, there is no data over here. So if you see here, I logged into the user that's called Surge. So if I go here, I'm going to go to Surge's profile, player data, and I'm going to add some data here. So coins 999, update, save player data, and if we run this again, we should see that it shows up in the UI. So there you go, we logged in successfully to Surge, and there it shows coins is stored in our database. So that's all going perfectly. Now what we're going to do is we're going to allow the user to input some data over here and enter a value for the data, and then update the database automatically without us having to manually go in here and actually update it ourselves. So the first thing we'll need to do is we'll need to create a public void for the button to call. So public void on go pressed, and when we press the go button, we're going to say PlayFab data.save data, and we're going to have to go and create a new dictionary. So we'll say a new dictionary of type string and string, and the values that we want to pass in is going to be, first one will be value name.text, and the second one will be value.text. Then we're going to have to create the onSuccess callback and the onFail callback. So onSuccess, we'll just create a success result, and then over here we'll just print successfully updated, and for our fail we'll just create the PlayFab failure. So now once we've actually updated the database, we then want to go back and we want to actually display it on our UI again. And in order to do this, once we've updated the database successfully, we're simply going to call this again. So we'll say PlayFab data.getUserData, and we'll pass in our onGotDataSuccess function and our PlayFab failure function as the callback. Now over here we're going to have to delete whatever is already in the UI before we actually display it again. So in order to do that, we'll just say for each transform t in scroll view, or whatever your parent transform will be, and we'll just say destroy t.gameObject. Okay, now back in Unity, in our PlayFab interaction manager scene, we just need to assign this function inside of our button. So on our send button, we can add another event listener, drag in our canvas, and on the PlayFab interaction manager script, we will select on go pressed. And now if we just log in again, you can see this updates to what was already in our database. If we go here and I type in, for example, axes and 12, there we go. You can see this updates our UI perfectly. And if we actually go into our PlayFab console and I reload this, you can see it's updated. We now have 12 axes. So I believe if we go axes 13 and we hit go, there you go. It updates without actually adding a new value into our database. So you can see how quickly this works, how nice it is. So from now on, basically all you need to do to get the information is PlayFab data.getUserData, and to save data we just have to say PlayFab data.save data with all the information that we actually want to save to the database. So that is insanely easy now. So now if we want to upgrade to Humongous Potion, let's say our player has got 3 of these updated, and you'll see you can also save strings to the database. So if we go save, you'll see that this updates all in real time. So this all looks like it's working very nicely. If you guys watch to the end of the video, I've got a script here that I've actually made with a few extra functions. Let me just show you this. So it's got try increment value, try get data of type t. These two functions basically means they're just a bit of a helper function. So try increment value takes in a string of key and amount. So for example, the key would be coins and the amount would be 12. Then basically what it does is it attempts to just directly increment the value of coins by however many you set it. So you don't have to go and manually do all that programming yourself. And then the try get data of type t. Basically all this does is, for example, this is an integer value. So if you try and get the data of coins as an integer, over here you just specify integer, it's going to return 999 as an integer value instead of string, which it is by default. As well as JSON objects, you can directly convert JSON objects into actual C# objects by using this method. So I'll leave a link to this download in the description. If you enjoyed it or if you learned something new, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button because there's going to be new content coming out. Thanks for watching.